And we're live. All right. Hi, everyone. Thanks for joining. Today, we'll be talking about OpenAPI Is People. This is the community panel. Thanks for joining. I'll quickly kick us off, and then we'll get into some questions. But first, one of the things that I love about APIs is they're where people and machines come together and meet. And if you look at it that way, this is about as close to the singularity as you can get today. Similarly, having OpenAPI as an industry standard way to describe APIs is pretty amazing. And that happens thanks to the ongoing work of many people. And today, we are lucky to have some of them here today. These are people who are working across different areas of the OpenAPI initiative and the OpenAPI specification that it supports. My hope is that by the end of your time with us today, you'll have a better understanding of the people and the processes that keep this a rich community good. Each one of these people is a pillar of the community in some way, and so we'll start with a round of introductions. After that, I'll ask some questions of each of you, and we'll wrap up with audience questions at the end. I'll try to keep up with the chat for the conference, so message me, Marsh, Gardiner, if you have questions. So to start things off, could you introduce yourself, tell us who you are, what you do, how you were involved with OpenAPI initiative or spec today, and what got you there in the first place. And I'll start. I'm Marsh Gardiner. I'm a product manager at Google. I work on Apogee's API management platform. I started that 11 years ago, and it's been an amazing opportunity to see this whole industry grow up as it has. My first involvement with OpenAPI was when Brian Malloy and I invited Zeke and Tony to discuss the cool things they were doing with API documentation at WordNick. And during that conversation, I was describing how we at Apogee were using the web application description language to describe the APIs in our API consoles, and that no one really liked describing these shiny new JSON APIs in XML. That prompted Zeke to joke, "Why waddle when you can swagger?" And the name stuck. If you want the more detailed version of that, Zeke gave a great talk yesterday on the Swagger origin story that I'd recommend checking out on video. After that, I helped kick off the Swagger 2 working group, and I now serve on the TSC TOB BGB and chair the marketing group for OpenAPI. All of these things will become more familiar, those acronyms, in the next few minutes as we go around the table. Why don't we do this? Why don't we go, I think, in the order in which we'll take the newest to the community first, and we'll work all the way back to the beginning. Lorna, could you introduce yourself? Tell us who you are, how you got involved with the spec. People probably know some of this because it's your third talk already. How did you get involved?
Sure. So, hi, I'm Lorna. I'm a developer advocate with a company called Vonage. We do communications APIs. And I came to OpenAPI because, when I joined Vonage, or Nexmo as it was formerly known, we already had API definitions for our many and varied APIs. About the only thing they have in common is they all have an API description. So I got to know OpenAPI, but I was running into not being able to do things I expected with it. And you know how it is, you ask around on the internet, and one person sent me to somewhere that sent me to somewhere, and I ended up here contributing to the spec itself.
Switching back and forth. There. Oh, your video hung for a second. Thanks. I had fun internet issues this morning, and hopefully they don't plague me anymore. Great, thanks. Neal, I think you're next.
Okay. Great, thank you, Marsh. Yeah, so my origin story is probably the least interesting of this panel. The OpenAPI is hosted at Linux Foundation, and I am the Linux Foundation program manager. So I was literally assigned to be on this project and feel very grateful and fortunate that that occurred, because it's been a lot of fun and it's a great group. The term program manager might sound like I get to boss people around, but if you know anything about this group, then you know it's probably a really good thing for me. That's not the case. So really, my role is more of a supporter and a facilitator for the group, and to help things move along and to connect with various resources at the Linux Foundation.
Cool. Thanks, Neal. Mm-hmm. Darrel, I think you were next.
I think so. So I've been in the API space for probably about 15 years now. I left the SOAP world and discovered a love for HTTP and REST, and spent a while as a recovering Restafarian. And I ended up in the OpenAPI world because somebody volunteered me to be in the OpenAPI world because they thought I could cause a lot of trouble. And so I joined around the OpenAPI v3 phase and worked a lot with Marsh and Tony and Ron and Jeremy on getting the OpenAPI v3 spec out of it. I'm a Microsoft employee now, and if you were in the panel earlier, you met my boss, Yina, who was awesome. We worked together on the Microsoft Graph API, so I get to play with APIs all day long and sit in reviews and share my opinions about how APIs should be designed. And I end up being the Microsoft representative to the OpenAPI. So I sit on the BGB with Marsh and sit on the TSC, and I think I'm still on the TOB.
I have a question on that one coming later. We'll go to Ole next.
Thanks, Marsh. Hi, everyone. So Ole, my name. I'm an architect at SmartBear. I was working at SmartBear when SmartBear acquired the Swagger technologies from, was it Reverb at the time? And not shortly thereafter, SmartBear decided to donate the spec to and create this work group. And Marsh, you were very involved in that as well. And ever since then, I've been the chairman of the OAI initiative, which doesn't sound as powerful as it might. But I'm mostly involved with helping, prospects talking to companies that might are interested in joining, talking about how the OAI works and how the community around it works, and that's what I've been doing mostly in the context of the OAI since then. That was like 4 years ago now, almost.
Awesome, thanks. Let's demystify some of these acronyms we've been using. Neal, I'll ask you. So I think it's really fascinating about the OpenAPI initiative that its member companies, who often they're competitors in the market, and that we can all come together and collaborate on this common good is pretty great. But there are times where that also, I'm sure, isn't easy. As the program manager, what are some of the more important community channels where activity happens, and what kinds of collaboration happens there? And what, if you're just interested in keeping up with what's happening and listening, what are ways to do that?
Sure. Yeah, so I would say first, my preference is to start with the technical developer community, because that is the part where OpenAPI is truly open source and anyone is welcome to join. There's weekly meetings on Thursdays at noon Eastern. There's GitHub. You can jump right on GitHub. They publish the agenda ahead of time for what they're going to be talking about. There's a Slack channel. Anyone who would like to join the spec channel on the Slack is welcome to reach out. I'm happy to add you onto that. There's a whole, I guess I could get into a little bit of the structure, but I want to also answer the part of the question, Marsh, you mentioned around where people can keep up. So one way to keep up is technically, I mentioned those different options. In addition, if you just generally want to keep up with the OpenAPI initiative, we have a website at openapis.org. You can sign up for our newsletter. We have a blog there as well. So there's different ways that you can stay connected without necessarily participating in the community, although by far, if you participate in some role in the community, you'll feel a lot more connected, you'll meet a lot more people, you'll learn a lot more about the inner workings, maybe figure out also where you can kind of plug in. I don't know if, Marsh, you also wanted me to talk about some of those acronyms we talked about, like the BGB and the TOB, or are you reserving those for
I think that'd be good. Although I think our Twitter handle too, right? That's a good way to sort of follow and see. We generally tweet our news out there, and then all of this activity is happening on GitHub. So the issues that you'll have to comb through things to find stuff. But that's how the spec evolves over time. But I think that covers it. I don't know if we missed anything, other panelists on that. If not, let's demystify some of these things. What is the TSC, TOB, BGB?
TDC.
All that. TDC, all of
we
that.
did
Yeah.
great debates about what the TDC was.
Yes. Actually, you want to start with that? Like, what was that debate, Darrel?
Well, we didn't used to be called the TSC, and there was the big question of, well, how do we involve the larger community? And we ended up using the TDC, which is the technical developer community, and this can be anybody. Like, basically, show up, get involved, you become implicitly part of the TDC, and we attempt to make decisions involving anybody and anybody who shows up. There are certain parts of our process and procedures that we defined as the TSC in order to make sure that the process runs smoothly, and the TSC members are elected members. And there are 6 of us currently on the TSC group. And so for just, when it comes to actually releasing a version of the specification, we'll make sure we have a vote with TSC members to say, yeah, is everybody comfortable with this? But the TSC is, it's partly a bureaucracy thing. We hope that we don't have to use it. And the technical developer community, or the TDC, is what really matters.
And TSC stands for the Technical Steering Committee.
Steering Committee, yes.
And but there are a couple of special roles that I think not everyone knows about on the TSC.
There are some special roles, yes. Well, we have the liaison. So when we have a BGB, so the Business Governing Board meeting, where all the members come to a bi-monthly meeting to make sure that we're all doing the things that we're supposed to be doing. We have a representative of the TSC who is the liaison person, and they communicate with the BGB what is happening in the TSC, and then the second
single point of contact. Yes. But there's also someone who won't give you up or let you down.
Yes, the Rick role.
But yes, there's a role called Rick.
Rick, yes.
Yeah,
we were so bored writing those governance rules. We needed some way of lightening up and saying, can we please get back to doing real work? But no, sometimes you need the governance, and that was very typical of our usual Friday meeting, the silliness that goes on.
So now everyone knows that this Easter egg is hidden somewhere in the governance docs in the OAI repo. Good luck finding it, people. Actually, why don't we then skip and talk about the governing board? And Ole, when companies are interested in joining the OpenAPI initiative, how do those conversations happen? What is the governing board, and what's its role?
Sure, thanks. Well, so usually they get in touch. Companies get in touch with us through forms on the website, and that usually goes to Neal, and then we set up an initial conversation where we meet with them. And these companies can be, very new to the field, and just they've heard the term somewhere, and OAI or Swagger or OAS, and they're just curious about what it is and how what it means, what it can mean for them. And others are very kind of straight to the point and know what they want. And those discussions we try to flesh out. Are they really interested in being an official member and having a seat on the BGB, on the Business Governance Board, or are they more interested in participating on the technical work, getting in the TDC, or they're interested in the TSC? And we try to flesh that out. We don't try to push them in any direction. If we think it's great, anyone who we talk to, if they just want to join the community, the technical community, and go head over to GitHub and join those meetings on Thursdays, and voice how they're using the spec and what challenges they have and how they'd like to see it evolve over time. And of course, if there is, sometimes for them there's a clear advantage also to be an official member of the OAI, so having a seat at that BGB table where we meet every 2 months, and where we discuss the budget and onboarding for members and governance of the spec, and anything in marketing events like this one, anything that kind of goes on non-technical related to the work of the OAI is what the BGB is usually concerned. And some members are really keen on being part of that and networking with the other members. And I think I'd like to go back to what you said initially, Marsh. I think it's very clear that we have a lot of competitors, members, but I think what's also so great to see is that we're all really aligned on the goodness of having that one spec that pulls us all together. And the space is still so large. There's room for all of us, and as long as we're kind of running reasonably in the same direction, I think it's a win-win situation. I think that's been very clear, and I'm guessing it's the same in the work that the TSC and the TDC does. So that's kind of how it works. And then there's the actual onboarding process is pretty straightforward. Neal's the expert on that, so I'm going to defer to him to walk us through that if that question comes up. But if you know, usually there's maybe a back and forth, some emails just to see where they want to start, and maybe the technical people at those companies reach out to the TDC or to join one of those meetings if they haven't done already. Just to see how they could engage with that group.
Yeah, it's definitely a big part of my role is that, you know, when new members come on board is to help point them to the right places of how to get involved and connect them up with different people in the community or different channels, just make sure they know how to get engaged. And so just, you know, I see that as a really important role, and that's part of that facilitation process to make it easy for people to get involved and try and understand, you know, what the structures are and how to use them.
Yeah, I think the important thing we want to stress in those meetings. I mean, there's a couple of things, but one is, once again, we're just as happy to have you as participants in the technical work. You know, it's not like we feel that we lost if you're not an official member. Anyone that's participating in the OAI or in that space in any way and helping us evangelize the use of the spec and evolve the spec is a win for us. But I also want to highlight that there's the BGB has no influence over the technical work, and the charter is very, very clear on that. So there's no way that, you know, if we, for some reason, the members would say, hey, we need to add support for this feature X in the spec, or we need to do this and that. There's no way for us to influence that apart from ourselves, of course, joining the technical work and hopefully, you know, getting others to agree with this in those meetings on Thursdays. But there's really no influence. There's no pay to play for the members to say, you know, now that we're a member, we'd like to see the spec going in this direction. We'll say, well, just head over to GitHub and get involved, and good luck. I mean, if the idea you have is something that resonates with the community, maybe you'll succeed, but that's really all we can say at this point.
I think it's a really important piece of how the whole operation works. And I think it was really important of its founding documents and charter to make sure that it had the separation. And it was, you know, thanks in part to the Linux Foundation for enabling that, the patterns that have worked for other projects before. I think it's also really interesting that, you know, some of the members, I mean, all of the members see benefit in the spec and its continued existence and are backing it with the financing it needs to do things like hold events like this. That's important. And some of those are vendors in the space, and some of them are people who are consuming the benefits of the spec. Like the spec enables them to do their work better. I think that Vonage fits into that category. Is that right, Lorna? And how did your company come to participate in the OpenAPI initiative?
Yeah, so Vonage are API providers. So we describe all our APIs with OpenAPI, and we find that enormously improves our developer experience, as well as our internal process for being able to discuss changes to the API, being able to produce accurate documentation. And I gave a talk about SDKs earlier. I actually can't tell you our origin story because I've worked there just over 2 years, and we already had API descriptions that were OpenAPI 3.0. So we were early adopters, but I don't know why. So they were just there. And I've been like, oh, okay, well, this is a new thing. Oh, this is a really cool thing. Oh, this is really instrumental. And we've gone from, you know, just using a couple of tools to really leveling up. So we have stuff happens on changelog. All of the API definitions are in a public GitHub repo, which powers changelog, API reference documentation. If you pull requests to that, it opens a whole review app, so you can see how the docs are going to look. So even our I would say non-technical, but maybe less hands-on code contributors, such as the product owners or the tech writers, can immediately get a preview of what that's going to look like in the reference documentation. So for us as providers, seeing this standard and seeing that users are growing to expect it, I think is really awesome. And I think it's something that is growing in awareness and also growing, so kind of from an education point of view, but also growing in terms of what you can actually do with it. Like, it's more than just docs now. The tool support is improving all the time. So we don't have nearly enough competitors signed up as members, in my opinion. Like, we should have all of the API providers here because of the quality of life improvements to the developer experience. So we came in, first of all, as consumers of the definition, as you initially described us. I personally am now a spec contributor because there was something not in the spec that I couldn't understand. I thought it just hadn't understood how to do it. I was like, no, it didn't exist. So in 3.1, it will. And that's because it's an open process. So you can meet the people and see what's happening and try to, patches are genuinely welcome.
I'd love to hear more about that. Like, as you realized that there was this gap in the spec, and you're exactly right to identify it. We sort of did half of the work and left the other half out, and you spotted that opportunity. What drove you to get involved, and what were you hoping to accomplish, and how did that process work? Because we'd set up this sort of proposal framework, but I think you may be the first person to drive through it. Yeah,
and that was a really interesting experience. So I started off trying to ask questions, like, who do I know on Slack? I've been in the API space for a long time. I wrote an O'Reilly book about PHP web services back in the day. And then I went off and did other open source stuff at IBM for a while. Then I came here and started working hands-on with APIs again. And it was like, okay, well, I can see. So I'm going to try and set some context of the feature that I thought was missing. So OpenAPI version 3 has support for callbacks. So when you make an API call and later on the server calls you back with an HTTP request, we can describe that. What we don't have is two-way APIs where something happens somewhere in the universe and then the server sends your endpoints an HTTP call. If you didn't make the first API call, OpenAPI 3.0 can't describe that. So I just thought I hadn't understood it. And I was like pinning people down and asking them at conferences. I am still enough on the conference circuit that I see people to ask. Luckily, I ran into Mike Ralphson at a conference. We're both UK based. And he was like, yeah, how would that work? And we had a bit of Twitter backwards and forwards. Then I started joining the Slack and I discovered this proposal process. I had some really good encouragement from the community. So like Phil was helpful, Taylor was helpful. She's posting in chat, so you can all thank her. But I have to confess, I don't know if I should confess this, but I'm going to. I have to confess, I was really skeptical because it felt like, you need to go through this hurdle. Like, stop talking to us. Here's the proposal process. No one else has ever made it through. But sure, that's the official process. Like, you need to go, like, we all have commit access to do what we like, and you need to go through the process that no one's ever made it out of. And I was like, really?
That's
anyway, it did seem like, also, this is my first encounter with standards bodies. And I did not truly appreciate the speed or lack of speed at which these things operate. Like, I haven't really come across that before. Like, I work in open source. You open the pull request, we measure, we don't measure, that's it. That is not how standards are made. And so it's been an amazing experience for me. So I wrote this proposal and I actually did get some feedback on it. And then nothing happens unless you join the regular calls, which are they're not a terrible time zone for me. So I joined the technical steering committee phone calls every week for a year. And now the webhooks feature will be in OpenAPI 3.1.
Yay!
You're welcome.
That really doesn't paint a very pretty picture. And to add to that, didn't you and I, Lorna, meet in Copenhagen and have conversations about this too?
Yes. So
this is where I first met you.
To be fair, I ran into Darrel at a conference, and I think the proposal had been like marked as accepted, and then nothing else happened for quite a long time. And then you have to, wait for the next release to come out, which also seemed to be quite complicated. I mean, it is a good story because it has a happy ending, and I feel like I have learned a lot. And also that the webhooks feature will be of great benefit to other APIs like ours that are quite modern and two-way, and we all expect push events and this and that now. So I think this is the right time to be adding it. But yes, I absolutely did corner Darrel at a conference and explain to him several times why he should be in favor.
Well, and I didn't agree, because it was intentionally not. Like, how on earth could you possibly get a callback if you haven't subscribed to the callback in the first place? That just makes no sense, because everything exists in an API, right? That is the entire world. So
that was funny,
Lorna
yeah.
convinced me
yeah, that's right. There was a few months of, no, that isn't how you do APIs. I was a bit like, well, we do, and GitHub do, and eBay do, and Stripe do. So maybe we're all doing it wrong. But either way, I'd like to describe it.
But it's a process, right? You need to understand people's different perspectives, and there are reasons why things get added to the spec. And one of the challenges is every little piece of functionality that goes into the spec makes it that little bit more complicated. Every little bit of complexity makes it that little bit less accessible to people who come to it for the first time. So there's a real trade-off and a balance to play. And so it's why we are really cautious. One of the things that we learned in the 3.0 process is we had all kinds of ideas about learning, adding new things, and we did do some simplifications, but we also added some new capabilities. And some of those just really took a very long time to pick up. And it was like, oh, well, we've added this complexity, but it's not bringing a lot of value. Right? So, which is why we introduced the proposal process and the kind of trial draft status. And you weren't the first proposal. Alternative schemas was the first proposal to go in. And alternative schemas went through this draft pilot project that we invented, which was specifically intended to say, okay, look, this is something that we think is stable enough for implementers to go implement, but we're not convinced yet that it's the right design, so we're going to ask implementers to go try it. And implementers went and tried it and went, this is too complicated. Which is good, because it means we didn't introduce a ton of additional complexity into the spec. And so dragging your heels sometimes pays off.
Yeah, now I've been inside the process a bit longer, I think it is a big responsibility. And caution is definitely the way forward. I think the way that the features are added with a full-on proposal and lots of discussion is really sane, and I'm really happy that I was part of how the proposal process should look. And I think also, while we haven't had a release for quite a while, that's also something that I don't think that'll happen again. So yeah, it has been a long process, but I would hesitate much less next time I want to open a proposal, because I know the system works now. And I also know what to expect, which I didn't really have before, but because I was meeting people that I was meeting at the technical steering committee or on the Slack, I was meeting in other API community contexts, and some of them did chime in and give a good pep talk. That helped me to kind of stick with it. And now I feel like I'm responsible for that. And being part of that community that kind of just eggs each other on in a really positive way.
I think there's a really important piece of context there is there was a major thing that happened in the 3.0 timeframe. 3.0 came out, and then Tony Tam, the original person behind all of this effort, decided his time was up and he'd done his bit and he moved on. And there's two things then. One is we had lost somebody who was really a driving force behind the spec. And all of a sudden, we had a lot more interest. We went from having 3 or 4 people on the call every week to having 8, 9, 10. I think we even saw 14 or 15 once, right? A lot more voices, right? And without that same leadership that we had before. And it took us a while to recover and find our groove. And I think we have got back into a groove now. And I think getting the webhooks thing out and having you go through that proposals process and it be successful was a major contributor to getting that groove back.
Mm.
And it does take advocacy. So I mean, I think you participated in many TSC calls over a year, joined the Slack, and advocated for this. And I don't know that it would have happened without all of that investment. And that shouldn't discourage people. It's these kinds of changes are hard, and one of the things we're often considering is the tooling burden that it brings. And that is what we spent a lot of the time in the TSC calls talking about. Things like, how will people use this? What will this mean to existing tools? That kind of stuff. I think there's another interesting thing that's changed between 3.0 and the imminent 3.1 release, which is the Semver question. And that was part of the reason why there was such gravity around the next version of the spec. Do you want to talk about that, Darrel? And I think you don't want to talk about that. But then talk about it at a meta level. This is the first real use of the technical oversight board. This is the first time I think we ever had to invoke it. Why does it exist, and why did it need to be invoked here?
So the challenge was we at 3.0 decided that we needed to be able to communicate effectively to consumers of the spec the significance of the change. And in the software development community, there is very commonly used this notion of Semver, where version number is major, minor, patch. And each of those changes have a significance. And so we adopted Semver in 3.00. And we then went off and we created 3.01 and we created 3.02. And then one of the major pieces of work was around introducing, allowing people to use the more updated version of JSON schema. A lot of people had complained to us that our slightly different version of JSON schema made it very difficult for using JSON schema enabled tools. And again, it's a burden to tooling vendors that now you can go and write some JSON schema, but then if it's JSON schema inside OpenAPI, well, it doesn't quite behave the same way and you've got to do different things. So in order to solve that problem, we needed to bring in some changes. And there was another change, which I don't remember what it was at the moment, but we ended up with a debate of, well, is this or isn't it a breaking change? And if you go back to the Semver spec and say, what is a breaking change? They hand wave and go, well, it's something that's not backward compatible. What does that mean to a spec that drives documentation tool, SDK tools, validation tools, mocking servers? Like trying to understand the impact of a change on all those different tools and making a decision, is this or is this not a breaking change, was extremely difficult. So we introduced 3.03, which had some minor little word changing that gave us a precise definition of what was a breaking change. And we said, if you have a version of a spec and you just go and bump the version number up, if you can bump the version number up and that spec still validates, that description still validates, then we consider it a non-breaking change. Well, it turns out that wasn't good enough. When we tried to bring the JSON schema in, there were some semantics we had around JSON schema that just didn't work anymore with the independent. And so, and I mean, it was really edge case. It's like, what does read only mean for requests versus responses? And what does write only mean for requests versus responses in description? And We never actually found any tooling that this thing would break. We've only hypothesized that it might break something. So it was like, are we really going to release this spec update as 4.0 because there might be some tooling out there that is going to break? Or do we say, look, this is not serving the purpose that major minor patch was supposed to serve, which was supposed to be a communication tool? It's supposed to indicate the significance of the changes. 3.1 is not a major set of changes. It is a minor set of changes. But there is the possibility that there is some breakage. So we made the very painful decision that was very hotly contested as to whether or not to stick with the pedantic version of semantic versioning or whether to use the more English version of is it a major or minor change. And could that be the last time I ever have to talk about that?
Yeah, it may be. I mean, it is an important thing that's different about 3.1. And it hopefully is the kind of decision that will help us in the future release with a better cadence, because we'd constrained ourselves with this, and it slowed us down. Hopefully this helps us go faster. But it also is unless I'm mistaken, it is the first time we had to invoke the TOB. So the Technical Oversight Board, it actually has a high membership affiliation with the TSC.
We didn't.
We didn't? It didn't
No.
require? Did we actually manage to?
We took a vote in the TSC.
Oh, you're right. We did.
Yes.
We managed to avoid it.
Needed.
We almost triggered it for the first time. And so then I'll describe it briefly. The TOB exists basically as a safety valve, because the last thing we wanted to do was to have to involve the governing board to resolve a conflict that the TSC couldn't figure out. So we have this extra layer in the middle just to keep that from happening. And we haven't had to use it yet, but we came really close.
Because we were foolish enough to have 6 TSC members, so you can have a tiebreaker.
Yes. Well, yeah. Oh, well, things we wish we'd known when we were working on the charter ages ago. Okay, Neal, I have a question for you. As you were, Lorna was talking about Vonage and how they were onboarded recently. When you do onboard a member, how do you help them orient, and how do you help them get their representatives and their folks involved in the community?
Sure. So there's a couple of things. First of all, one of the first things I do is just point them, here's a list of resources, but then I also offer to have an individual conversation, because I think sometimes having that back and forth, understanding what their needs are and what they're looking to get out of the OpenAPI initiative can be really helpful. And I have with governing board members, so when somebody joins the member, as we've emphasized, you do not need to be a member of the OpenAPI initiative in order to participate in the spec development and evolution, and that's really, really important. But of course, we'd love to have more folks become members, because it helps to create some energy and opportunity. Again, for this is one of the best examples, is the API Specifications Conference. So typically I'll also have a separate meeting just with whoever the governing board representative is, to give them up to speed on what are the issues that we're discussing, and kind of review and overview of the budget, because that's one of the main responsibilities of the Business Governance Board. And and just answer their questions and point them to the resources that they need. And also for many of our members, typically joining an OpenAPI, joining any Linux Foundation project like OpenAPI Initiative typically also requires joining the Linux Foundation. So there's a different set of benefits that can be involved there. So I also try and point them out what resources they have available, and special benefits from that as well. I'd also like to point out that for nonprofits and for academic institutions, accredited academic institutions, there's no charge to membership. So it really is about bringing in more voices into the community. We have no quota whatsoever in terms of how many we happen to have. I think it's like 37 or 38 members right now, but there's no particular quota, no particular number that I've been hearing from the community. So it's really the community that drives us, not me. I'm more, again, in that facilitation role. But what I hear from the community is really why they like having additional members is because it enables events like this API Specifications Conference and other ways that the group spends the money, and it also brings more voices into the community and more different perspectives and the possibility for even more discussions around verticals, so or special interest groups. So we have a couple of special interest groups in the community right now, working groups. One is an SLA, service level agreement group, that is looking at the needs for service level agreements for API specifications, and then are collaborating together to figure out a proposal to take back to the TSC to have review and discussion. There's a newly formed travel working group that has had a lot of energy, a lot of interest, so that they, again, can kind of figure out, well, do they have special needs related to the specification itself, and how do they get engaged? And maybe they want to have conversations among themselves, or even potentially split out into other groups. There's some potential for other working groups that if there was energy in the community, because again, it's really the community that drives what happens. I've heard discussions around whether there should be a security working group, because security issues are certainly something that comes to the front a lot. And there's also fintech and financial services, and that also is another area where maybe or maybe not there'll be working groups, but certainly a possibility, again, if there's interest. So there's a lot of different ways to get engaged. But that onboarding piece, yeah, I kind of see myself acting kind of like a Sherpa, helping them sort of navigate how they need to get connected. Sometimes they ask me for, can we talk to specific people? And Darrel's one who comes up a lot, and and he's very gracious with helping people get oriented as well.
Ole, is this something that comes up during the membership conversations too? The concept of verticals. I know travel has been a recent one of interest. It seems like healthcare, fintech, like there are a bunch of ways in which the spec can be used in sort of these verticals. Or is that a topic of interest?
It does come up. I think what the other kind of verticals that come up are more technical verticals, like security or SLAs, as you mentioned, or and those of you that were around in the SOAP ages remember the different WS standards that kind of address WS security and WS blah blah blah. And we, although I'm not advocating in any way that we go down that route, there is definitely a need in certain verticals to have more flexibility or more possibility to describe security aspects of an API in more detail, or in any other kind of more technical area. And I think that's something where we're seeing, as more and more companies adopt the spec across different industries, I think there's also the need becomes more eminent, where that are needs specific to certain industries or certain usages scenarios. And I would guess that over time, we'd see more efforts in that area. And I think that's definitely something we want to facilitate. And by connecting those members and identifying those common traits across different members, if they're either technically oriented or more functionally oriented or non-functionally oriented, I think that I definitely see that coming down the road.
Yeah, and I think it's a great opportunity. By the way, it struck me when Darrel was talking earlier that if you're watching this video or you're participating today in this event, you are part of the developer community. And if you're interested in any of these working groups, that's another way to get involved, and would definitely recommend it. I'm going to take a couple questions that I'm seeing coming up in chat, and then we'll come back for some closing points too. So Tony in chat asks, curious, when mapping out the future, how do you decide now that you have enough weight to introduce a breaking API change? Anyone want to take that? I can take a crack if not.
I made one comment in the chat, and I think one of the bars would be if we make a change and it breaks existing descriptions, it makes existing descriptions invalid, then that would be sufficient in order to do a major. And the example I gave is, say we renamed paths to be URLs so that we could include query parameters as part of the operation identifier, then that would be definitely something we would do in a 4.0. It is true that line is fuzzier now from a technical perspective, but I think it's easier to look at a set of changes and go, yeah, this is a big update. I mean, everybody knew 2 to 3 was a big update. right?
Right.
Even though it is mechanically convertible. So once you've done enough changes, it's fairly self-evident.
Yep.
He
I think that's a
says,
good
to be proved wrong very quickly.
Well, yeah, as it comes up, you can't spell wrong without Ron. So it's a shame he's not here today to let us have our typical TSC banter. There's also another question from Gio. Hope I said your name correctly. Can you comment on some of the other existing proposals and continues? The overlays one seems to have a lot of potential. I'll take a first pass at that. Yeah, I think overlays is really interesting. The idea here is that rather than thinking of a spec as something that can be that's really one document, it's considering more the various reasons why you might want to treat that as a layered document. One example could be, for instance, if you wanted a localized version of the descriptions. That's something you could accomplish with a spec extension today with tooling that supported it, but it's also another way to sort of either have alternate language descriptions, or another one would be like if you don't want your tech writers messing around in your source code and you're using your source code to generate your specification, then having the ability to sort of create this layer of documentation that could be merged down for consumers is another approach. Any other comments on the overlays proposal? I think it's really exciting myself. I would encourage people to get involved if they see use for this.
Yeah.
I'll give one more use case quickly, and then I'll pass it to Darrel. Another one is like if you want to have sort of implementation-facing metadata in your specification, like this is how you're going to set a quota or a policy you might apply in middleware. That may not be information you necessarily want to publish to your consumers, and having
within the TDC regulars that this is a big thing that we want to get done. And we tried, and we went a little too far, and it got too complicated. So we backed off a little bit, and we kind of captured where we're up to in that overlays document. But once we get the 3.1 out, I think that should really be our next major effort, because it opens so many different possibilities up. It is quite a job for tooling to implement, because you're now dealing with multiple documents. You're dealing with when do you overlay them, how do you deal with the output, how do you maintain the inputs, and all of that management. But I think there's a ton of value that will come from that. So I'm very excited about us working on that.
Yeah, me too. Taylor made a great point that we should cut earlier too. She said, I don't know if this was mentioned, but we talked about the marketing committee and some of the new education work. Really great point. So there's a marketing group that meets every Friday. It's much like the rest of the initiative. This is all volunteer driven. It's people making time in their schedules to sort of help identify the right opportunities and organize what resources we have in the right direction. And one of the things that came out of that was some education work. And it was identified that really one thing that would help people more is if we had better materials to help people understand how you might approach specs, tutorials for this, and that's in progress right now. So that became essentially a proposal that went to the governing board so that we could fund it properly, and it's those kinds of things, those opportunities that come up in the marketing group, and often when there's something as big as that, require some governing board approvals. Any other thoughts? Some of you join marketing calls also, in addition to your other roles.
Yeah, I mean, I certainly join marketing calls quite frequently, and the group works on a number of different things that support community. Because the business governance board only meets several times a year, it's not really operational, right? It can't. So a lot of the things that the business governance board also would like to see sometimes come down to the marketing groups. That's in their kind of channel for where ideas come from. the group often works that, as you can also, I think, tell, I think just the API Specifications Conference is a great model reflecting some of the values of the community. Is it's not just about OpenAPI, right? It's not just about the OpenAPI spec. So part of the discussions go around like what other efforts in the ecosystem, what other conferences does the OpenAPI initiative want to support and be a sponsor, things like that. So those are some of the things. And sometimes there's some synergies that come out of that, where then, for example, the technical group might see that that's going on, go, oh, well, a number of us are going to be at such and such an event. Maybe we should hold a special event or an unconference or something to get some discussions going. So sometimes there's some synergies or, interactions between those different groups.
Yeah, great point. A good example is API Days. We don't have, back when we had in physical location conferences where we could all get together, we didn't have one in Europe. And we partnered up with API Days in order to participate in the Paris API Days. I think a couple of years you ran that, Darrel. And I think it's a great way to reach out. Any other questions coming through the chat? Tim Burks asked about the free OAI membership for academic institutions. I think I saw, Neal, that you covered that.
Yeah.
Anything more to say?
Just, we have Her Majesty's government. So that's a fun one to say. Yeah. I don't think I don't know that we have any academics. Sorry, go ahead.
No, I was just going to say also the Dutch government picked OpenAPI as part of their standards, which is cool also. But yeah, Her Majesty's government.
Yeah, I've spoken at some of the UK government events, and I get lots of questions about OpenAPI, so it's definitely alive and well.
University of Sevilla, actually, they they were also heavily involved in the SLA work. So a lot of the interest in SLAs and how specs might are a great way in which to represent some of the information about SLAs. That was driven through them. I think that's all the questions I've seen from there. I do have some parting questions as we close down the panel here. Think back. I'm curious from your role and the ways in which you work with the specification and the initiative today. What opportunities do you see for people to get involved? And if I were to ask this another way, I'd say it like this: if you weren't already busy doing the things you do for the OpenAPI initiative, where would you see the opportunity to step in? Actually, Neal, why don't I start with you? And since you happen to be first on my screen, we'll go from there.
Okay. Yeah, so I think that it really depends, right? So we have the open source part of it and the TSC and the technical developer community. So if you want to get involved in that way, then as I mentioned, feel free to contact me, and I'll get you hooked up with the Slack channel. There's a lot of discussion. Slack is one of the preferred modes of communication within the community. It just has emerged that way for whatever reason. So that might be a good way to figure out where you can fit in terms of going through PRs or what have you. That's beyond my skill set and my domain, but that's certainly one way. If you become a member, we have the marketing group. It would certainly be great to get a little bit more energy. We're working through things like a code of conduct, which we're very, very close to completing. We just have to figure out sort of the enforcement part. So we have kind of a semi-working document. If we could get people participating a little bit more in some of those areas, there's been some creative ideas that have been floated, but we haven't necessarily been able to make as much progress as we would like on some of those. I think there was a start to a document to weight actually the value of different conferences that the OpenAPI initiative could sponsor, and so that we can have a more systematic way of approaching how to support those those events. There was another one around verticals. I think there was somebody, I believe Baljeet, who came up with a spreadsheet around different verticals who are involved or who are using it. And so if we look at getting more input from different vertical industries, there could be some effort and outreach in that way. So I just think that participating and on a regular basis seems to create some opportunity and some conversations and ways for things to emerge. Plus, over time, maybe we could, get people stepping up in some of the roles that are currently there, so that other folks are freed up to explore their creative opportunities. And that's kind of broad and vague, but that just popped in my brain. So.
No, great, thanks. And let me add a little bit of context to the Slack piece. When we have these regular scheduled meetings for the TSC or for the marketing group, if we only were able to move the ball forward once a week, things would go really slow. Now, with the spec, a lot of it happens in GitHub issues, and so it has that opportunity to get involved. But for people who want to have discussions like, well, what if to have a much sort of smaller quantum of communication, I think Slack is great for that. So we see a lot of chatter happening there. Great. Lorna, what would you identify as an opportunity to get involved in, or what is your next effort to champion?
That's a really good question. And I mean, to be clear, technically I'm an outsider. So I don't sit, although I joined the tech steering committee, like I'm a familiar face for sure, but I don't hold any of those roles. My employer recently joined as a member of the OpenAPI initiative, but I'm also not my employer's rep to any of those boards. I'm just here. I consider myself the unofficial advocate for OpenAPI, and I've given a few talks on the topic. And I think being part of the ecosystem is really important. Looking at the open GitHub issues and the discussion that's happening there, that's really important. And I see questions going past in the chat about how to open a proposal, open an issue. People will talk to you and tell you where you're going wrong and make suggestions and point you at the right resources. That's also pretty time zone proof, which is useful for me. I'm based in Europe. I think there's a lot, we have the kind of formal education piece that we just spoke about, but we're not going to pay that tech writer forever. So there's always going to be room for improving examples, answering questions on the GitHub issue queue, sharing tips about tools, curating our lists of supported tools. So I think it's not just about what happens here, but it's also about what happens like the next step out. I'm a contributor, or at least an issue reporter, on a bunch of tools that work with OpenAPI. So while that's not necessarily a titled position or like doesn't affect directly the spec, I think it's a really important part of the ecosystem. I do have some triage access on the GitHub issues now as well, so I have to go and tidy things up.
You are official.
Close.
Yeah.
Yeah. Just like, but it needs that because the people, it's a very small number of people. They all have real jobs as well. So everybody sort of chiming in and being like, I think this one should be closed. I know how to answer this question. Have you tried this other tool? Actually, the bystanders who are proactive, we need more of them. And there's loads of space for more of them. I could do a full-time job. There's that much more stuff that I wish I could do. So for me, you don't need permission. You don't need an invitation. Join the TSC calls if that's your thing, for sure. But just even asynchronously, keeping an eye on what's happening on a GitHub project, you'll find something.
Really well said. In the interest of time, I'm going to quickly go to Ole for what opportunities do you see, Ole, for people to get involved?
Thanks. Well, actually, I'm really intrigued by what we talked about earlier, the vertical stuff. I think there's definitely a need for creating some kind of infrastructure for extensions, domain-specific extensions, and I would love to put some work into that to help make it easy to kind of propose new types of extensions, get together in groups to work maybe around security or other areas. I think that's really one way of helping the spec or the use the usage of the spec in certain domains that we will never address at the spec itself because it's just too detailed for whatever. So I think that's a really intriguing area to get into.
Yeah, I think that's a great one. Good. And then Darrel, I know you're about to go give the closing statements for the conference, but if you have any suggestions for people how they might get involved.
I have a super sad answer. I think there's massive opportunity in SDK generation. I think we could do a ton there. And as the PM who owns the Microsoft Graph SDKs, I'm really sad about the fact that I haven't yet been able to do more in that area.
Yeah. Yep. Yeah. Fair. And then, so we're at time. Thank you all for joining. I will add one more to those observations that Taylor brought up in chat, which is education. Right. There is so much supporting material that can help other people down this path to create, and that's another way in which to get involved. Thank you all. This has been a great conference. Thanks for coming today.
Thank you, Marsh.
Thank you. Thank you, Marsh. Thank you, everyone.